Hello, everyone. Tom Bandy here. Lon has asked me to offer some additional video comments to the written responses I gave to your questions regarding my book, Pilgrim Band. And before I do that, I want to first thank you for your questions, which really were all very perceptive and very interesting. And I appreciate your commitment to think about and discuss these ideas. I'm going to offer a few comments, pausing between each one so that you can digest and discuss them further. So first of all, I want to offer the comment that a number of your questions reflected your interest in church renewal, and in particular, finding a path forward for small, aging, traditional, perhaps historic congregations. And it's true, I read a report just this last month predicting another 15,000 churches will close in 2025. And the number really isn't that important because that number has been fairly constant and growing every year. But the real point is that denominations are devoting a lot of time to thinking how to repurpose properties as well as honor aging churches. And a lot of that discussion is oriented to repurposing properties around faith-based nonprofit ministries or social services that would have some form of faithful, believing core within the nonprofit board. So I want to say that the Pilgrim Band is not intended as a strategy for church renewal. There are many obstacles to that, and I've mentioned some of them in my responses to your questions. But the Pilgrim Band concept is an option for leadership formation or leadership renewal. We have learned that churches will not go where the leaders had not gone before them. Leaders lead. And if you want to take the church deeper and further, the leaders have to go deeper and further. And so the Pilgrim Band can be a kind of recipe for the session, for the leadership core or the board of a church. And this is particularly relevant in Presbyterian tradition because, after all, with Presbyterians and many Protestants, it is really the laity, the lay board, the volunteer session, who are regarded as spiritual leaders of the congregation. And where they lead, people will tend to follow. But they need their example, their mentoring, and their forward thinking. So the Pilgrim Band is a kind of a model for the spiritual maturation of a session and the covenant that they might have together. And it can begin very, very simply, really, given all the complexity and detail I offer in my book. But it can begin with a session fairly simply with a covenant that they share together and with God, simply to articulate their intentions, their striving, you might say, for spiritual growth and spiritual formation, each with the other. And of course, they will make mistakes and they will struggle, but that's part of why it's a covenant that they share together, and they can then hold one another mutually accountable for how are you doing? Is anything sidetracking you? Is anything blocking you? Is anything holding you back? And you can see how that very covenant precipitates mutual mentoring conversation within the session. Let me just share with you very briefly um, a chart that I've often used in consulting with a session. You see it before you. It's really just a simple covenant of spiritual habits. The person or group with whom I share self-examination every month is written at the top. I usually ask people to identify some sort of talisman, object, song, image that will help them focus their meditation or their attention. I may come back to that in a moment. But you can see I've kind of broken out the spiritual habits that we form in the session into different categories and different actions. So of course, there's prayer. It can be done daily. I invite people to go more deeply into that, exactly when daily, in the early morning, at lunch. Bible reading, it could be Bible study, disciplines of listening to the public, and weekly worship, and perhaps some sort of small group participation, missional service, and other methods of meditation, like journaling and so on. And I break it down into individual commitments to take a certain action, to think of it and schedule it as it fits into their lifestyle, uh, to have a sense of when the timing is right in terms of the week or the year. And at the bottom column or the bottom row, in particularly identify how the leader thinks that their prayer life, their Bible reading, their listening to the public, their weekly worship, their small group participation, their missional service, their journaling or whatever, but their hope as to how it will help them, how it will help them find wholeness in life, how it will help them overcome obstacles, break bad habits, or so on. And I think you can see that this covenant is private. It's held in confidence by the session, and it's not a tool for judgment, but for encouragement. It's, how are you doing in this? Can we help you along the way? Is it working? Why is it working? Why is it not working? And so on. And you can see how a covenant like this can help, precipitate that deeper sharing of the Pilgrim Band. And the session can become like a Pilgrim Band, and the leaders then lead. As they go deeper and further in Christ, they can begin to open up and mentor with more confidence other people to go deeper and further in Christ. And that may lead to church renewal, but it may also be that it would lead to a more powerfully motivated and successful faith-based nonprofit or some other form of service. So again, the Pilgrim Band is not really a tool for church renewal. It is a tool for leadership formation. And I'll pause at this juncture. Welcome back, everyone. My second comment has to do with the questions you raised around trauma and the importance, the centrality, you might say, of trauma to the whole journey of the Pilgrim Band and how one deals with trauma and overcomes trauma. It certainly is true that the Pilgrim Band is written very much in mind with the rising mental health issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also the broader picture of trauma in our culture and trauma experienced in different ways among different generations, boomers and busters and Gen Z and so on. But some comments about this. In 2006, I wrote a book called Talisman, Global Positioning for the Soul, in which I tried to describe three, you might say, three modes of living, which I called life on the edge, life in between, and life at peace. Life on the edge is our lives that are lived in moments in which we are very driven or passionate, having a new job, entering a new relationship, passing into a new phase of life, having a child or a baby or whatever. And these are often very, very frantic, pressured. They may be very joyous, they may be very sad, but it's life in which we feel really very much on the edge. But a lot of our life is life in between. And this is where I talk about boundary situations and living between different past and future events and the ambiguities and the struggles and the questions that occur in that time in which we kind of feel in between things. And then there are occasions when we feel life at peace. And you might say this is life when we really feel we've achieved some form of balance or some form of wholeness. And the questions you raised with me about should we feel guilty about the sense of wholeness we might feel, which is a kind of feeling of survival guilt, so to speak, looking at the trauma of the world and, should we feel bad about feeling a relatively balanced and happy and whole in our lives, leads me to the comment that life at peace is always very fleeting. It's very momentary. We may feel life at peace and very balanced and whole today, and then tomorrow something beyond our control, or something resurgent from our own bad habits from the past, carry us into life in between and life on the edge. The key to surviving trauma, I would describe as a combination of faithfulness and perseverance, or to put it in a better way in the context of the Pilgrim Band, it is that connection between kairos, or incarnation, perseverance, and calling. It's that experience of kairos, joy, the inbreaking, the incarnational experience of God, which gives us hope, that helps us to persevere or endure or struggle or work through whatever the traumatic experiences are that face us. But the outcome of that is also a sense of calling or purposefulness in our life, which is part of why I developed the diagram, which is at the end of the Pilgrim Band book. And that leads me to offer a comment about wholeness and the motivation that drives Pilgrim Band participation. Why do we keep at it? Why do we emerge? Why do we engage in the Pilgrim Band? That depth of accountability and trust, and which is often very risky and daring and even unsettling. But why do we do it? Why do we persist in doing it? Or if we do it for a while and then drift away, come back to that relationship even years later, even from great distances. And I think the reason is the combination of gratitude and compassion. When we experience a life at peace, when we have those momentary times of feeling wholeness, what really we should feel is not guilt about that, but the combination of gratitude and compassion. And these twin virtues, so to speak, are not just Christian. They're common in the philosophies of Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and other religions. But this combination of gratitude, you might say, for grace undeserved and yet received, and that leads to compassion for the world that continues to live on the edge and live in between and so on. That is what really drives, you might say, and motivates continued participation in the Pilgrim Band. And I would invite you then, if you have these moments of wholeness, instead of worrying about feeling guilty about them, I would encourage you to pray and ponder about the gratitude that you feel, because the balance we experience in life is not really an achievement. That's modern thinking. In ancient thinking, it's a gift, and often an undeserved gift. And so we feel a great deal of gratitude and appreciation, and that should translate then into compassion and a desire, you might say, to help, to bless, to work with, to serve, and to help others who are struggling on their way. So, yes, trauma really is at the root of what drives faithfulness and perseverance, but it is rooted, it hopefully for the faithful, it will bring them to a sense of kairos or incarnational moment, which can then drive them to a sense of gratitude and compassion and service. I'll pause again. Welcome back again, everyone. A third comment. A number of questions went philosophically fairly deep, and we're asking questions about the true self and about the connection between individualism and identity and so on. And that led me to offer the following: that in the Pilgrim Band, in following, you might say, ancient ways and ancient thinking about mentoring and mutual mentoring, has a different, a very different sense of identity and the roots of identity than modern pop thought does. And I think when you enter into the life of the Pilgrim Band, you have to shake loose of certain modern assumptions. And one of those modern assumptions is the priority, the centrality of the ego or individualism. Let me say it another way. In the Age of Enlightenment and in the modern world, we have been drawn into a conviction that that life is a matter of external relationships, much like billiard balls ping off of one another. Each ego impacts another ego, and so on. And such is the life of competition, and such is the life of a heart of war, and such is the life of capitalism, and so on, as we become objects to one another. But in ancient times, they thought in terms of internal relationships. That is to say, in which every person is internally connected to the internal constitution of every other person. And that would extend even to the created world, to the natural world around you, that there was a sense of internal connectedness, that my identity was tied in some way to your identity and to the nature of the universe. And that's really about internal relationships rather than external relationships. And there certainly is there's philosophies today that expand on that, like the philosophy of Paul Tillich or Alfred North Whitehead or Teilhard de Chardin or others. And this is much more in keeping with antiquity. So we tend today to identify individualism or being myself or having identity as a form of egocentrism, whereas the ancients would understand identity to be tied to relationships, not necessarily mentoring, although mentoring tends to awaken the internal connections we have in relationships. But really, our identity is shaped more by our relationships, both horizontal and vertical. By horizontal, I mean our identity is shaped by our relationships with each other, both over space and over time. So historically, you know the old saying, the sins of the fathers are visited on the children, and that's echoed in Old Testament thinking and so on. And we tend to rebel against that concept. Well, every individual has sole responsibility for themselves and is not responsible for what their parents or their ancestors might have done. But that is not at all how ancient people really thought. The identity of who I am now is very much shaped by the success and failure, by the positive and negative of my ancestors and so on. And there really is a sense in which we do have our identity is shaped out of our responsibilities, both to recover from the past and to live responsibly into the future. And then there's the vertical dimension of identity, or we might say the ontological nature of identity. For the ancients, that was a connection of the soul and the source, between the individual soul and God. Now, in modern times, the soul is largely discounted. It's a ghost in a box, or it's just a myth, or it's a bit of poetry, and we don't ascribe any kind of real sense or identity or reality to it. But if we think the way antiquity thought, that the soul is directly internally connected to the source, that my identity is somehow connected to the eternal, so to speak, then we have a different, perspective in terms of our identity. My identity is shaped out of my connection or disconnection with the divine. For us today, the soul, if anything, is the shadow cast by the ego. It's a ghost. But for the ancients, the ego is the shadow of the soul. The soul is what's real. The myth is that we have some sort of independence, and the connection that we have between the soul and the source is really the hope that drives, you might say, all of our historical efforts to strive for virtuous living, to strive for justice. This is not ego driven. This is soul driven. And so, in a sense, the Pilgrim Band, like antiquity mentoring relationships, it is a rediscovery of or a recovery of the soul as what really is genuine and true about identity, and the soul being internally connected both with history and with others and with the divine. And it means that our identity is indeed rooted in relationship or in mutual participation, you might say, with one another and with God. And that is, you might say, the deepest sense of the quest of the Pilgrim Band. It is helping each other recover, discover again the significance of the soul in terms of who I am and what God wants me to become. Again, I'll pause. Welcome back, everyone. A number of your questions that you raised were very challenging and delved into some deeper theological, philosophical history. And you were asking some questions about um, uh, free will and fate, the kind of the paradox of coincidence and providence. You were able to look back historically to try to compare some of the thought of Augustine and Calvin. Augustine, who was both influential to John Calvin, but also influential to Paul Tillich, my mentor, and to others. And because they took Augustine in different directions in different ways. But also some interesting things raised in my mind, contrasting free will, fate, providence, and so on, with the dialogue between Erasmus and Luther, which was another subject of interest and exploration in my research. And so it leads me to offer these comments that in the context of the Pilgrim Band and the mentoring relationships in antiquity, there was an assumption that every human being had a destiny, that or to say it another way, every human being, because their soul was internally connected to the source, and because their soul was internally connected to history and to relationships with other people, because of this very interconnectedness or interrelationship that the soul, which is the root of human identity, had with the person, that each person, in a sense, had a purpose in life, had a destiny in life. And I try to uh, capture that in the diagram in my Pilgrim Band book, which kind of relates heartburst, heartbeat, and heart song, and the alignment of the alignment of one's heartbeat, and that is to say the core values and convictions and the things that we hold dear that we will never give up. The heartbeat that shapes our behavior patterns and our habits, and how that links to the heartburst we have in compassion for the world and our empathy for other people, and how our service and connection with that then inspires or elicits from within us what I call the heart song, or the song in the heart, which can't really put into words, but helps identify our purpose in life, where we feel that we are going or where we feel we are called to go. And this link between heartbeat, our sense of gratitude, heart song, or our heart burst, our sense of compassion, and heart song, our sense of calling, is very much at the center or the depth of conversation within the Pilgrim Band, within the mentoring relationships, as each one of us is striving to discover and uncover, you might say, well, what really is the heartbeat that is pumping in our veins, the unique heartbeat that defines our character, our sense of virtue, our sense of responsibility, our value systems, and so on. And I'm not just talking about our ideals or our ideologies. What I'm talking about are our habits, our unconscious behavioral habits that we don't even realize we're doing, but which are constantly in subtle ways and daring ways revealing who we really are, what we really believe, what we really think, what we really value in life, and the spontaneous words and the spontaneous deeds are more likely to reveal that, our heartbeat, than any mission statement or policy we endorse or ever, whatever. And so the Pilgrim Band helps us to uncover that, shape that, divest ourselves of bad habits and acquire good habits into our spontaneous life. And the Pilgrim Band helps us, you might say, focus the heart burst. It helps us extend from our gratitude to a sense of compassion, to listen to the world and to observe people around us. And as we do that, we find that our heart breaks, we come to tears, we have a heart burst for someone other than ourselves, but with whom we feel an intense sense of urgency and connection. And I often talk about that in the context of demographic and lifestyle research as a tool with which we can discern that. And the more the Pilgrim Band helps us focus heartbeat and heart burst, slowly but surely the soul and the source begins to elicit a sense of what I would just say is the song in the heart, our sense of destiny or purpose or what we're really about. And this doesn't have to be like a career path. It is simply this is where we're going in any career in which we happen to be. And we will change career paths many times, just as we may change intimate relationships many times. But this remains true. This is you might say, the song in our heart. This is what really makes us move forward in history. And the reality in the ancient world of mentoring, as well as in our world of the Pilgrim Band, is that we are constantly straying. The You might say what we described earlier as a life at peace or wholeness or whatever. In a sense, that's a moment of perfect alignment, of alignment where our heart beat, our heart burst, and our heart song in our life at this moment is right in line with each other. And those are the moments when we experience the most intense joy or satisfaction. So that you might say the experience of true joy is a kind of litmus test for the alignment of our personal mission or our destiny. I like Augustine, I am not a great believer in coincidence, rather than a great believer in providence. We are less free and we are than we think we are, and we are less vulnerable to luck and coincidence and shaped by coincidence than we often think we are. But in fact, there's a providential movement of spirit that goes throughout all history and all life. And uh, it's kind of like a very common phrase these days in detective movies, if you watch them on PBS, is how the brilliant detective does not believe in coincidence. Well, it's true. There's a synergy of events that leads to an intuition of greater purpose. And even in my own life, I've often felt, and you look back and you think, this was not coincidence. It just didn't happen that I met this person or was influenced by this book or this or that or whatever. But there was a purposefulness behind it. And if we look at that, if we want to explore that purposefulness, one way to do it is in the categories of heartbeat, heart song, heart burst, and heart song, that alignment. How does this apparent coincidence impact the heartbeat of our life? How does this apparent coincidence impact the empathy and the heart burst and the tears that we weep for others? How does this coincidence impact the decisions we make in terms of our trajectory of our choices? And when we look at it that way, we see that really it is not coincidence, but this is spirit influencing our lives to keep us aligned to our missional purpose. And in a sense, the great blessing of that is that this is the ultimate sense of joy. I'll pause. Welcome back, everyone, once again. Let me address another aspect of the questions that you raised with me. And it builds on our conversation about the importance of relationships and establishing identity and internal connections and so on. I mentioned earlier of different modes of life on the edge, life in between, life at peace. And often that is uncovered because of our relationships, the stresses, the tensions, the joys, the sorrows, and so on that we have in our relationships. You ask questions about being on the boundary, about boundary zones. And the more I observe and the more I've experienced in terms of the Pilgrim Band, the more I'm aware of how some of the most important conversations that we have are precipitated, not just out of relationships, but more particularly about exploring boundary zones or the boundaries in our relationships or the boundaries in which we find ourselves in life and that we share with our friends. Often, when we reconnect with an old friend or we reconnect with our Pilgrim Band, even over a long distance or a long period of time, it is driven because of a boundary, because we feel in between in some way, torn in some way, on the brink of something else. And we reach out to begin a conversation. And in a mentoring relationship, one of the things that's very important is to have that intuitional antenna very alert, because many times a friendship is renewed or a relationship is renewed even after a long time. And if we listen carefully, there's a hidden reason for that. There's a motivation for that. The upfront reason really isn't to find out about your grandchildren. The upfront reason is to talk about something else. And they may not even know what it is that they want to talk about. And it is the role of the mentor, so to speak, to begin to listen and discern and elicit and tease out what is the real question here? What is the real boundary situation that you are facing and that we could talk about together? And this boundary zone in our relationship, these boundaries that emerge, I think there are two things that are most significant, and I was going to use the word cataclysmic about them, traumatic even about them. And the one is that these are moments in which we feel most transparent to the infinite and most vulnerable in the finite. That is to say, these are moments of tremendous vulnerability when we maybe we feel we're at our wits' ends or we're facing an ultimate question or something, but we're just kind of at the edge or the end of our rope and but there are also moments of transparency to the infinite when we have this sense that spirit is saying something, speaking something, doing something, shaping something, changing something. And this sense of the immanence of God is what generates the urgency of being on the boundary. It is this sense of the nearness, and that may seem like the threat of God. Sometimes even the threat of non-being is often, in fact, the power of being. We may feel as if we are threatened with destruction, but in fact, looking beyond it, it is not non-being, but it is being itself, which is impacting our life and changing our life. And there's this kind of ambiguity about being and non-being in the power of being. Spirit is the power of being. It changes our lives. And this transparency, this immediacy that we feel in the presence of God is part of what generates that boundary condition. And we feel very vulnerable to it, very malleable, very fragile in the face of it. And the second piece of that is part of that vulnerability is that the power of being or spirit shatters our myths about ourselves or our worldviews. It shatters many of the cultural norms or cultural forms that have had symbolic power to give our life meaning. So it's in the boundary situation, for example, that we discover that some of the cultural forms, and I include the church as a cultural form, or liturgical worship as a cultural form, or dare I say it, even our hermeneutics around scripture as a cultural form. But some of those are shattered all of a sudden, and we are left on the boundary in a quandary, so to speak. And this immanence of the divine or spirit is very disconcerting because it shatters these myths about ourselves and our worldviews. Now, one thing that hopefully will awaken is a sense of compassion, and that's one reason we turn to the Pilgrim band. That's one reason people connect with you over a long time or long distance, even for seemingly trivial reasons. There's a deeper reason, and what they're really looking for is not answers, but compassion. They want a heartfelt hearing and a genuine response, and hopefully wise guidance out of your personal experience. All of which adds up to be what they're looking for is courage. They're looking for what Tillich would have called the courage to be. That in this boundary situation, in the moment of greatest transparency to the infinite and vulnerability in the finite, I am overwhelmed and I am near despair. It's traumatic. It happens all the time, like it or not. And what I need from you, in a sense, as a mentor, is not an answer or a fix-it solution. What I need from you is the compassion or the encouragement or the courage to keep going and the courage to be rather than not be. And that to me is again why relationships are constantly shaping our identity, both in the connection with others and the connection with the divine. Pause for thought. Welcome back again. On to another comment. At one point, you connect with a phrase that I used in my writing about that spirituality is in the air. The fastest growing religious movement, so to speak, in the contemporary world is not really religion per se, but spirituality, or you might say personalized or personal religion. And this is changing dramatically even traditional religion. The truth is that even in your own congregation, even in your own lives, most of your they're not really aligned to the traditional polity or theology of a John Knox or a Luther or a Calvin or whatever, but they have brought in all kinds of other disparate ideas and convictions and so on to shape to personalize or to shape a personal kind of religion, and that is really changing all of our denominational traditions. Spirituality is in the air. But as I comment in my writing, this is both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is that we have a chance to sort of speak to the spirituality that's in the air. And in speaking to that, we don't start with faith, we start with anxiety. To speak to the spirituality in the air, you have to start with what are the existential anxieties that are shaping and driving your life. First, let us explore those anxieties, and then we begin to explore, well, how does spirit speak to those anxieties, and what are the hopes and yearnings that we bring in the midst of those anxieties? Or to say it another way, how is it that we desperately, urgently want to experience the immanence of God in our lives? And that changes for different people at different times. So spirituality is in the air. There's an opportunity for dialogue and conversation to go deeper into the discovery of God's immanence. But there's also a threat. And Tillich used the concept of the demonic to describe that threat. And his use of the word demonic is not really in any sense the way we popularly tend to use the word demonic. What he meant was, the demonic was, in a sense, abstractly, the threat of non-being, or to say it more particularly and powerfully, it's the threat of manipulation. It is the threat of abuse. It is the threat of violence. It is, in the way I would say it, it is the threat of an abuser who is trying to steal your soul. And as I've often said, in terms of trauma victims, we only know we have a soul when someone tries to steal it. And that really is the work of the demonic, of the abuser, of the threat. And then we suddenly awaken to the fact that we have a soul. It hasn't been stolen, but it might be damaged. It might be broken and needs to be healed. But 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 it is this threat, you might say, of non-being the demonic, the abuser, that is also the threat of what happens when spirituality is in the air. The one thing that we did once have with the dogmatic religions that we held highly was that they in a sense controlled that. They were the check, the reality check, you might say, that would hold back the demonic influences that manipulate our lives. And as those break down, we see that other more demonic religions begin to take over control of our lives. And certainly one of those is religious nationalism today. It used to be even 20, 30 years ago, the great, you might divide in in Christian life in America was the divide perhaps between Catholic and Protestant or between liberal or conservative and so on. But that really isn't the divide in right now in this part of the 21st century. And that's the divide between, you might say, faithful Christianity and religious nationalism, which is really the main heresy of today. And that's kind of the great divide at the moment. And the greatest threat, you might say, to both evangelical and mainstream Christian life is the rise of religious nationalism, which in part, although certainly not fully associated with some of the mega churches and so on. But in my life, in terms of consulting and coaching, I've worked well with both the extreme left and the extreme right in terms of religious views. Lots of disagreements, but appreciation also. And as I've watched the feeds and listened to colleagues and friends, I'm well aware that both on the evangelical side, the conservative side, and on the mainstream or even liberal side, all alike are combining just to kind of see this demonic threat, you might say, coming, rising up in terms of our culture. So there is both an opportunity and a risk when spirituality is in the air. And part of the great challenge that we have is to let go of some of the old arguments that divided the Christian world as really not particularly relevant anymore or urgent, and to be able to unite together, you might say, in a more authentic and orthodox Christian response to the powers or abusers and manipulators that would try to distort the Christian faith for their own purposes. And it is, whenever I think of Easter, in our situation, we are not unlike Mary Magdalene, who first discovers the empty tomb and pleads with the ancients, the gardener, and asks, they have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they have laid him. And in a sense, they strive to take away our soul, and we don't know where they're trying to take it. And we need to resist that in unity and recover the authentic meaning of the Kairos incarnational experience. I'll pause. Next comment. In a number of questions, you were clearly probing what I thought about the future of the church, and particularly the future of the small church. And in fact, as a side comment, I would suggest that in many ways the future of the large and the mega church is actually um, dimmer than the future of the small church. And even the large churches are beginning to split up into multi-sites and so on. In the late 20th century, early noughts, the future was to go big and more the future is to go small. So in a sense, the small is better in terms of the intimacy of the Pilgrim Band and the ability to go deeper and deeper with God and with God's mission. So I would say that there'll always be a future for established churches of the kind that we know. There will be fewer of them and so on, but there's a future there. There's wealth there. But um, for me, the real future of the 21st century and on of the church is to rethink the church not as a church family, but as a way station. And the way station metaphor was really kind of driven home to me as I was on one of my speaking tours in Australia. And I was in Sydney at the time and became aware of the number of Christian faith-based cafes, coffee houses, or internet cafes that were sprinkled all around me in the neighborhood. Clearly founded around, you might say, a Christian value system and a sort of a very simple Christian theology. But they were really conversation centers and internet centers and technology centers where people could come in and out and find depth conversations, a la the Pilgrim Band. And sometimes people would stay a long period of time. Sometimes they'd come for a brief time and leave. Some of these patrons of the cafe would come back again and again and again. Some of them might just stop on another business trip a year later. There might be people like me who were just coming in from another country, another planet, and engaging in conversation. But within the internet cafe, within the cafe, there were mentors or catalysts of conversation who could sit with you, talk with you, intuit, sort of some of the baggage that you're bringing to the cafe, help you struggle with the boundary situations, et cetera, et cetera. But it was there was a foundation, but then it was a very flexible vehicle of communication. And much like the way stations or the inns and hospices were when the ancient and medieval pilgrims would travel on their crusade or their journey to Jerusalem or to whatever the holy center it was that they were traveling to. And again, these were establishments that stayed in place, but what they assumed that no one really became a member. It was not about membership. It was just about participation and catalyst for participation and being there for people to communicate over long distances and spaces. The more and more I see it is that becomes the nature. The way station is in a sense the future of the church, and you kind of think, well, how might we repurpose our property, or how might we upgrade our technologies, or how might we establish the core group of mentors or the catalysts for conversation that need to be the serving staff, so to speak, at the way station. And this is why I commented in my written response to your question that in a sense the way station is in a sense becoming also a kind of residential center that it is a place for short and long-term residents, visitors and longer-term people, and it is sometimes a place where the catalysts, the mentors, actually are also kind of residing and living there, because in the way station pattern of the Christian church, the way station is you might say the center of society. It is where you live and move and breathe and have your being. It's not something you visit on Sunday morning and occasionally for a meeting on Wednesday night, or where the youth group happens to meet, or it's not a center of social services where you have office space for Meals on Wheels or something like that. It's none of that. It is a way station in which you are showing hospitality with a profound turn of conversation. I'll pause. Okay, this was a chance to renew my coffee. And now focusing another comment to your questions. Um, you ask an interesting question that I'm often asked actually in American context, and that is, are pilgrim bands rare? Do they really happen? How frequently do they happen? And you noticed in my previous comment that I referenced my visit to Australia. I've actually seen the multiplication, the emergence of pilgrim bands most clearly outside of the United States, outside of American culture than within it. Australia, Western Europe, Africa, Asia, Canada, um, and than I do in American society at the moment, although it is clearly emerging. Pilgrim bands emerge whenever and wherever, I think, people begin to wake up or recognize ultimate concern. What really ultimately concerns you, and the recognition of that involves obviously a fair amount of honesty and risk, uh, and and that's why it's harder to emerge. Sorry, I'll drink a bit more coffee to get my voice back. I mean, the Pilgrim Band tends to emerge in contexts in which there is strife, or in which there is struggle, or in which there is poverty, or in which there is controversy, or whatever. And there's a certain sense in which, in American culture, particularly the suburban culture and the affluent culture, um, it is less likely to emerge because people are often less able to confront or face or discover ultimate concern because it's camouflaged. And you mentioned by sports, by entertainment, by affluence, by wealth, by the pursuit of wealth, by any number of other ideological debates or whatever. It's covered over. Whereas outside of America, to an extent, there's less affluence to kind of cover it over and to hide it. But I would like to note there are, well, five or six places, ways where where you are most likely to see the emergence of a pilgrim band. Number one, you're more likely to see the emergence of a pilgrim band in the context of addiction intervention. All those 12 step groups, all that concern of addictions of all different kinds, whether it's alcohol or drugs or sex or money or greed or whatever. I mean, but all these different kinds of addictions. And whenever you see an intentional effort to intervene and break self-destructive habits that people chronically deny, addiction, there you often see the emergence of a pilgrim band. The second context is reconciliation, whether it's among war-torn countries or among refugees or ethnic differences in a community or economic differences or whatever the polarization might be. Whenever you see a genuine effort at reconciliation, a genuine desire for peacemaking, which I admit at the moment in polarized American culture is somewhat rare. But whenever you see that genuine desire for reconciliation, there you're more likely to see deeper conversations about belief systems and value systems and calling and purpose and so on. Pilgrim band. Third, you're more likely to see the Pilgrim band emerge in the midst of artistic creativity. I think someone there has already talked about music and the arts and so on. But it isn't so much in the performance of those as in the development of those. So in many ways, I'm more likely to see the Pilgrim band emerge in a high school or a public school where where students are learning music and developing and sharpening their creative imaginations than I am in the context of the entertainment recording industry or something like that. So you kind of look at that level creative development, and that's where you're more likely to see the Pilgrim Band, say between teacher and students and so on. Fourth, you're more likely to see the Pilgrim Band emerge wherever there's a growing awareness of cultural stagnation. And that could be economic stagnation. For example, I've when I used to travel or teach and consult in places like coal country in eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, Appalachia, or in western Pennsylvania, or southern Missouri or Mississippi, or places where I've been like that, where they're hard against it in terms of you might say economic and cultural stagnation. I'm more likely to see the potential emerge for the Pilgrim Band, which is why in terms of university life, for example, I'm more likely to see the Pilgrim Band emerge in one of the historic Black colleges or universities than actually I am at Yale or Harvard. I'm more likely to see it in a community college than a major business college. But because there's that awareness, that recognition of a cultural stagnation and a desire for new life. What am I, four or five? Fifth place, I'm more likely to see the Pilgrim Band emerge is in a context of scientific speculation. And that may be, in nuclear physics, or that might be, disciples of Einstein or something. But you already see that there's speculation. There's a risk. There's an openness to talk about metaphysical and ontological concepts, and not just the commonplace engineering concepts that dominate much of our culture today. And then finally, and not it's not the only one, but the last place I immediately think of when I look for the emergence of the Pilgrim Band is in a context of technological innovation. You see this a lot more in startup countries, startup companies, rather than existing corporations. You see this in inventive arenas of technology, where you have inventive minds coming together. You see more speculation and more conversation about human motivation and human values and what it means to be human. And I see Pilgrim Band conversations kind of focusing on issues like what's the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence? The answer is the soul. But anyway, in these different contexts, that's where I'm more likely to see the emergence of a Pilgrim Band. But that means that's, where am I less likely to see it? And to be quite candid, I'm less likely to see it in a church, which tends to be contented, complacent, looking to the past, and so on. Or I'm less likely to see it in an established university, or I'm less likely to see it in a major corporation, or I'm less likely to see it in you might say traditional education methodologies. And these are all still fairly dominant in terms of American culture. So if you want to look for the Pilgrim Band, don't look for the suburbs, look for the urban core, look for the rural remote. Don't look among the affluent, look among the poor. Don't look among the peaceful, but look among those who are in strife or in struggle. That's where you're more likely to see the emergence of the Pilgrim Band. I'll pause. Next comment, hopefully a briefer comment related to the questions you raise about the limitations of words and language and the emergence of the image, you might say image-rich, data byte-rich world for communication. And my comment here is I may have misled you a bit in talking about the the um, the disempowerment of words. Because what I'm really talking about is the lecturing word, the sermonic word, the presentational word. But what really is important, if a church wants to connect, you might say, in a new way or a more vibrant way with the culture around them, is conversation. Word as conversation is utterly crucial, you might say, in terms of contemporary culture. You know, what actually is the value of an image, a picture, a database, a song, in a sense? It is a catalyst. It precipitates a conversation. And by conversation, of course, I mean a respectful conversation, a true conversation, a vulnerable conversation, a conversation of give and take, of listen and share. I talk about more about conversation in my book, Pilgrim Band, which cultivates, you might say, the art of conversation. And what we're losing today is in a sense, the art of conversation. And if a church wants to renew itself, what it really needs to do is redevelop their art of conversation. It's not about adding a new technology, putting in video cameras or video screens or better sound systems, and all that may help, but only if it contributes to conversation. What really is a spark that grows a church is the quality of the conversation during the hospitality time. It's not fellowship. It's not just fellowship. It's not just chatter about, politics, sports, and whatever, but it's the ability of conversation following whatever happens in worship, whether by word or image, but the quality conversation that goes deep and goes far and is respectful and draws people in and helps them live better lives. And if you listen in on the conversations that you have over coffee hour, you often will realize this is why my church is declining. And this is why the real conversation is happening at Starbucks or the coffee house or the internet cafe. That's where the depth, that's where the reach, that's where the risk, that's where the vulnerability, and that's also where the boldness and the confidence and the hope is really being expressed. And in so many of the post-worship conversations of a church, you don't see that. And that's really why people don't stick with a church, why they don't come back to the church, because the conversation you have is not rich enough and deep enough. Now, in programmatic talk, that often means that the churches that tend to grow these days are the churches that invest heavily in small group ministry. That is to say, the conversations over coffee hour lead people in a deeper way into deeper conversation in some sort of small group, which may or may not be akin to the Pilgrim Band that I talk about, but it leads them somewhere midweek. But much of the conversation that we have in our church doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't go anyplace. And so the public does not connect with our church. So this is not a hospitality conversation. It's not about better sandwiches. This is about equipping leaders, particularly maybe your session leaders, the Pilgrim Band that may be a core of your church, to be able to be catalysts for conversation that will rival or better the conversations they might otherwise have in the coffee shop. I'll pause. My last comment, a video comment to share with you, and I'm sorry if these have been a bit wordy and long, but I hope they are helpful. My last comment follows on the previous one, and that's about conversation. One of the things you raise is about the seven vicious cycles or self-destructive habits and the seven interventions that happen in the context of the Pilgrim Band conversations, and whether those themes of vicious cycles and interventions, could they not actually become part of the conversation of a church, and help a church, you might say, go deeper and go further in their faith, and along the way become much more relevant to the general public in terms of their own quest for meaning and purpose. And the answer broadly, of course, it is. If if the conversation of your church was more about the vicious cycles in which we to which we fall prey, and how we can intervene to break those vicious cycles and find hope and renew our sense of purpose and meaning in life, the church becomes vastly more relevant to the public. Whether that leads to worship participation or not, whether that leads to membership growth, whether that leads to financial contribution, I'll be quite candid, all that's irrelevant. I mean, if you do the former, if you are able to help more and more people find meaning and purpose in life, probably it will help all those things, but also it may not. This is not a method for institutional renewal. It is a method for spiritual renewal. And in our highly mobile society, it isn't necessarily a recipe to rescue declining church buildings. It might be a method to find a way to repurpose church buildings. Mainly what I want to say though is that you don't just begin at the deep end of the pool. You don't just, walk up to someone in coffee hour and say, "Hey, let's talk about 7 vicious cycles of self-destruction," or "Let me help you, get out of your self-destructive habit of low self-esteem and guilt and anger," or whatever. It doesn't happen like that, and that's why in the Pilgrim Band, the chapters kind of proceed in order. There's a stage, and the first stage is kind of let's talk. And the next stage is, well, let's walk. And then the next stage is, well, let's trek. And in the initial conversations that we have in a church, we're never going to invite people to trek together. But we can invite people to talk together. You can say to people, well, let's talk. You have an issue, let's talk. But let's not just talk here. Let's meet for coffee. Let's have lunch. Let's talk over here. And let's talk, and I'll listen, and I'll share out of my life experience and accumulation or lack of accumulation of wisdom, and you share with me, and and we can talk together. And then if that talk goes deeper and further, you can invite them into a broader conversation. Let's walk together. So we're not just going to talk for, once or twice over coffee, but we're gonna be in social media together, and we're gonna email, and we're gonna phone each other, and we're gonna, you know, kind of journey together. And not only that, but we will invite a friend. I know someone who has similar concerns or issues and would find this beneficial. Could they walk with us? Could they join our conversation? And so let's talk over time evolves into let's walk. But that timeline could be a day, a week, a year. I mean, all these develop in their own time. But there is an intentionality about that. There's a risk in that. When you invite somebody to talk, you're opening yourself up to risk. And when you invite other people into the conversation to walk, you open yourself up to new challenges. And then the next stage, of course, is, well, we've talked together, we've been walking together, and now you kind of get to the really, really serious business of trek together. Let's really work with each other. Let's really accelerate accountability with each other. And now we're going to trek through the wilderness, over the mountains. We're going to trek across the rough terrain in order to get to our spiritual destinations. So I would invite you, when you think about conversation as really the depth of conversation as a renewal of a local church, you also think strategically and realize that it comes incrementally. The invitation to talk, the openness to walk, and the risk to trek together. And at the end of that time, everyone will continue to go on their own journeys. The church is, after all, in a way station. It's not an institution. And so people will go off on their own, and they'll talk with new people, and they'll walk with other people, and they'll trek in a new direction. And you may never know where they've gone or what's happened to them, and they may never know for you. You may never know what influence you had on them, for better or worse, nor they with you. But what we have to be confident about is that the talk, the walk, and the trek is really all just part of the larger movement of spirit, of the providential spirit in the world, of being, the power of being, you might say, in the world, to use different language. But we never know where our conversations will lead, but spirit will take whatever we have given and make it fruitful somewhere else. Just as when we encounter a new person or we talk with a new person, we have no idea really how spirit is already at work in their lives and has brought them to us in our conversation. So all this is to say that you cannot do any of this unless you are having, you might say, a lively conversation with God. You might say a spiritual journey, a journey of the soul and the source, an interconnection between the soul of the person and the spirit of the divine. And it is that intuition, that awareness, providential, that is the broader context of the Pilgrim Band, which is really just a microcosm of a larger macrocosm of spirit at work in the world. Well, I hope these comments have been helpful to you, and always glad to receive an email from anyone, and I would respond as quickly as I can. And thank you, Lon, for inviting me to do this. And I wish you well in your future conversations. God bless.